This presentation for Arthur Miller's The Crucible goes along with the guided notes, and this will be the last pre-reading exercise that we do before starting the play. There are 3 parts to this presentation. The first part is an overview. So The Crucible is an American play that was written in the 1950s by Arthur Miller. It focuses on the residents of Salem, Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials, which would be the latter part of the 1600s. And themes explored in this play include greed, guilt, motivation, and morality. This 1950s drama was heavily influenced by a couple of historical and cultural events. World War II had just ended the decade prior. And along with the ending of World War II came about a big boom in domestication, such as people in America were really happy the war was over. And so young couples got married, they started families. I'm sure you've heard of the term baby boom. This is during that time that there was a big boom in having babies. Suburbs came about, and many other forms of domestic life took off. Also, there was a desire for change. And then there was also some feelings of guilt and exploration of identity. So The Crucible premiered in January 1953 in New York City. The author Arthur Miller was born in 1915 in New York City as well. His father's business failed because of the Depression. The Depression took place from 1929 through the decade of the 1930s, and the family had to move around a lot because they lived in poverty. Once Arthur Miller became an adult, he left New York to attend the University of Michigan and returned to New York City after graduating college. He did not have luck with writing right away. However, eventually he became famous for his play All My Sons in 1947, which premiered on Broadway, and then a couple of years later for Death of a Salesman. Some interesting details about Arthur Miller is that he was married to Marilyn Monroe for a few years. Altogether, he had 3 wives in his lifetime. He wrote The Crucible in the early 1950s, which was a time where the Cold War was heightened, along with people's fears of the Red Scare and a lot of discussion about communism. And I'll go into more about that momentarily. Arthur Miller lived a full life and died in 2005. So an overview of Salem, Massachusetts. It's located on the coast of Massachusetts, and it was settled mainly by Puritans in 1626. Puritans are a group of people who left England so they could practice religious freedom, and often they let their religious beliefs guide their daily lives. And I'm going to stay on this topic for just a moment because it's important to have a good understanding of what made the Puritans so unique. So even though life was not good in England, England was an established country. So these people took a major risk by leaving this already established country, leaving behind their family, their friends, their work, their home, their customs, to voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to a territory that had not been built up or inhabited other than by Native American tribes. So just the journey itself contained a lot of risk. During this time period, captains of boats or ships, however you want to refer to them, used stars in order to navigate. Well, what do you think may have happened on a night that was cloudy and the stars were covered up? It wasn't uncommon for the ships to lose track of their course and then take sometimes days or weeks or even longer to get back on course. But yet the ship only had a limited amount of food. And so starvation and death by starvation was a real concern. Also during this time period, there wasn't any way to really know that impending storms or severe storms. Okay, sorry. Okay, so during this time, it was not really possible to forecast severe storms like how we have now. And so oftentimes when captains could forecast a storm coming, there wasn't enough time to change course. And so ships capsized. And then if perchance the ship made it according to course within the time range that was anticipated and didn't run into any major storms, there was also the spread of disease because there's a large group of people confined to a small space, and the diseases many times resulted in death. And so this was a very courageous journey, if you will. You may be wondering, why on earth did they take all this risk and, just to come someplace that didn't have hospitals or shopping centers or schools or anything fun? And the reason is because they were leaving behind a quality of life that was very poor, hoping to create a new society, a new community with a much better quality of life that included the opportunity to flourish financially as well as practice religious freedom. Unfortunately, though, the Puritans not only repeated what they escaped from in England, but to an even worse degree. Salem, Massachusetts, most known for the Salem witch trials of 1692, and it has the nickname of the Witch City. This is a picture of the Puritans arriving in Massachusetts. And this is a modern photograph of the Salem Witch Trials Memorial. If you had the opportunity to visit Salem, Massachusetts, it's my understanding that there are various historical sites and museums that tell the stories of the Salem Witch Trials, and probably very interesting and intriguing. All right, so an overview of the issues in Arthur Miller's A Crucible, and do consider these things before we start to play in just a couple of days. Think of greed. How do you define greed, and is greed ever a good thing? Consider guilt. What leads people to feel guilt? Motivation. What is the biggest motivator in your life? And then finally, morality. List your top 3 moral rules. In other words, what are 3 rules that you live by in order to lead an ethical and positive lifestyle? And then finally, how do these fit into our ideas of America? Remember, this is about American literature because English 3 covers the span of American literature. So keep this in the back of your mind that this history and the literature are closely tied together. All right, part 2 is going to go over some important information about the Salem witch trials, and I'm just going to touch on these items briefly because we have already read sources and watched videos about the Salem witch trials. So this is just a brief review. So Salem witch trials occurred from June through September of 1692 in Salem. Contrary to what many believe, it only lasted a few months. It did not last a long time, although a lot of damage was done in a short time. The Puritans were the group of people who were involved, and the townspeople were in a state of hysteria about witches and evil. And just a physiological note about hysteria, that when a person is feeling emotional extremes, let's see if I can remember it. Hang on. Oh boy. The cortex. Okay, so the cortex of the brain kind of stops working. And so when the cortex of the brain stops working, the brain is not in a state where it can make logical, sound, common sense, rational decisions, which is oftentimes why you may have heard the advice, do not make any big decisions while you're upset, or maybe just sleep on it, knowing that you would be calm in the morning following a contentious incident, let's say. And so when the cerebral cortex is offline, people are having this difficult time making good choices and good decisions. And so feelings such as fear and hysteria tend to escalate quickly. Consider the beginning of the pandemic when you could not find toilet paper on the shelf and people were buying toilet paper in massive amounts that they did not need, and stop and think, toilet paper, pandemic, why? What's going on here? Well, that's an example of how mass hysteria can affect the brain. And so the idea that the people in Salem were experiencing a state of hysteria, keep in mind that that could only escalate as it gets worse. And the more it escalates, the less these people are able to think rationally and therefore make sound decisions. All right, so some facts about people prevalent in the Salem witch trial history. And also, these people are characters in the play because the play is based on this history. You will be introduced to Betty Paris early on. She's a young girl. She's actually Reverend Paris's daughter. And the play opens up with her becoming ill. She is experiencing symptoms such as fever, extreme pain, running around the house. And then eventually that illness spread to other children in Salem. And it's worth noting that these children are all friends with each other. And they're all teenage girls, too. And so they include Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott. Doctors were called in to find the reason for this sickness, but they could not find a reason or explain the illness. However, they had to have some kind of explanation because they're doctors, right? That's what people expect. So they blamed it on witchcraft. And these townspeople were easily convinced because they were already in a state of hysteria, among other states of mind that were not good. And then to further the hysteria along, they chose a servant in town to suspect her of witchcraft because they had to have someone to blame for the children's illness. I mean, it's their sweet, innocent children, right? And so they targeted a person who was different from the rest of the town, both physically and culturally. And that person is Tituba, Reverend Paris's slave from Barbados. Tituba was the first to be accused of witchcraft. And when people were accused of witchcraft, because more would follow afterwards, they basically had two choices. Choice number one was that they were punished, and this was death by hanging. Second, it usually happened pretty quickly too. And there was not a due process. And the second option would be for these people to confess. And confessed is in quotation marks because the confessions were not always genuine. For the most part, they weren't actually. People were just confessing and essentially lying about participating in witchcraft in order to be saved. Therefore, they could continue living. And so some people chose their integrity and their dignity and chose not to lie and therefore were hanged. And then some people said, you know what, what's most important is that I'm alive at the end of the day. So I'm just going to go through the motions and confess, even though I didn't do anything wrong. Those are the two options. The casualties during this few months of the Salem witch trials included 19 men and women who were put to death. One man was not hanged. Giles Corey was pressed to death. He was forced to lie down and stones were piled on him until eventually the weight crushed him. Extremely brutal. So oftentimes people ask, why did this happen? How did this happen? Well, there are a couple factors that come into play. First of all, people were suspicious and fearful. One of the respected Salem townsfolk, Cotton Mather, published a book about witchcraft. Well, think about this for a second. If Cotton Mather is revered in Salem, then he's going to be a credible source for the people of Salem. And so if he's writing a book about witchcraft and saying witchcraft exists, then people believe him and therefore believe that witches do exist. People were in a state of stress, constant state of stress, actually, because they were at war with Native Americans. The Native Americans inhabited the land that would become the 13 colonies before the Puritans came over, and they were not happy to give up that land. And so one of the main characters, the antagonist in the play, Abigail Williams, lives with her uncle, Reverend Paris, because she was orphaned. Her parents were killed by Native Americans, and that was not uncommon during this time period. Death and evil were on the mind of many for numerous reasons, but also because disease spread was rampant and they needed an explanation for why loved ones became sick suddenly and unexpectedly and often succumbed to that sickness. And then finally, Puritan culture easily accepted the devil because they were so religious and the devil is mentioned in the Bible. There are other explanations, however. So the teenagers in the town were bored and got carried away. So let's stay on this for just a second. The Puritans did not have fun often at all. I mean, occasionally they might have like a town get together. But for the most part, their days were spent working. And when they weren't working, they were reading the Bible or they were at church. Being that when they arrived to the area that would become the 13 colonies or was the 13 colonies, there wasn't any kind of infrastructure, stores, basically everything that the Puritans needed, they had to produce on their own, whether that was building a home, farming their food, taking care of health ailments or having the materials take care of health ailments, just anything. Like they had to produce those necessities on their own. And that was really, really, really difficult. And so these teenage girls who happen to be all the accusers at first wanted to do things that teenage girls like to do, such as dance and flirt and just have a good time. And being that they were not allowed to do these things, they acted out in other ways. Now, in addition to teenage girls, eventually the accusers would go on to just be people around the town. And oftentimes they were jealous people. They could be people who are jealous over land disputes, over hierarchy of authority in the town. And being that it only took spectral evidence, also known as hearsay, for someone to be accused and arrested, these jealous people realized it was a very easy way to get rid of the people they didn't like. Just say that they witnessed the person doing something suspicious and they think the person's a witch. And then there you go. And then finally, general sense of depression in the town. As I just mentioned, the Puritans worked nonstop and studied their Bible nonstop, and they did not have a life of wealth, happiness, and freedom. And depression and misery, it's like the saying goes, likes company, and it tends to spread and affects one's thoughts and life choices. Okay, part 3, the last part, historical context. So this is where the author's purpose becomes known. So this play has appeals to the topic of communism. So we're going to backtrack a little bit to the time of the Great Depression, where American people felt upset with the government because many people lived in poverty. It's actually where the saying dirt poor came from, because dirt poor referred to folks who were so poor they lived in homes that did not have floors. So the floors of the home were dirt, hence dirt poor. And so people were barely surviving, and they felt some kind of way about that. They figured that every American deserves the basics like food and clothing. And communism was presented around this time on the other side of the world and by Karl Marx, and it offered a solution to poverty. When Karl Marx first presented the ideal of communism, it was because there were many poor people living in Russia. And just like during the Great Depression, they were not able to provide for their basic necessities, and contention built among the people. And so the idea behind communism is that everybody works as hard as they can, like max out. Some people will be able to produce more, like for instance, if you're young and strong versus if you are older or you're sick. But how much you produce or how hard you work doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, money is divided equally among everybody regardless. And therefore, there would be no rich and no poor. And so the idea behind communism was to make sure there was a society where everyone would be taken care of and there would be no poor because there could be no rich. Well, that's not how humans think. Humans are ambitious and goal-oriented, and just the idea of I worked much harder than you and I produced much harder, or I produced much more than you did, but yet we get paid equally. Not a whole lot of people would be okay with that. And so it's a failed ideal. But nonetheless, during the Great Depression and emerging from the Great Depression up until World War II in the 1940s, there was a push towards communism in America because it offered a promise of the ending to the Great Depression and a promise that poverty would end as well. In 1939, there were 50,000 Americans who were members of the Communist Party. So along came World War II, and I'm sure at some point you learned that in World War II, America was fighting against Germany along with other countries on the other side of the world. And the form of government, or I should say the form of economy in part of Germany was communism, as well as some of these other countries. And so this basically goes into the Cold War. But because the enemy embraced communism, communism was now seen as un-American. And was overshadowed by a surge in American patriotism. Or American patriotism. So we're going from one extreme to another. People are disenchanted with America during the Great Depression and are pushing for communism in order to make sure their basic needs are met. Shift over to the other end of the spectrum, basically, where they're anti-communist because communists will eventually become the symbol of evil. And they are very patriotic and pro-America. And this shift in mindset happened over 2 decades. In 1945, America won World War II, defeated the German government. And it's worth noting that communism is a form of economy, fascism is a form of government, but they are often associated together. And so fascism is a government led by a dictator that suppressed opposition of any kind. And just to give you a little bit of background about the Cold War, because it is relevant to this play, there was no fighting in the Cold War. It was essentially the Soviet Union, which embraced communism, had a goal to spread communism around the world. And so they targeted vulnerable countries, knowing that vulnerable countries would be looking for a solution to overcome their vulnerability and would be the easiest targets. And usually the vulnerable countries were the countries that were poor. And so what America did was America tried to beat the Soviet Union to having dialogue with these countries and provided them with money and aid and other necessities so that they would not be in a state of desperation and vulnerability, and therefore would ignore any kind of Soviet Union influences. And so that's what the Cold War was, is like mainly a competition of stopping communism versus spreading communism. All right, so this is pretty much everything that I just said. I just kind of was ahead of the slide, if you will. But to add to it, America was emerging as a world power, but so was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, as I've just mentioned multiple times, embraced communism. And they competed with each other for pretty important aspects such as space travel, nuclear weapon development, and also communism and dictatorship, government economic style. This is a picture of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were arrested in America in 1950. They were accused and charged with supplying atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union. And as a result, the Soviet Union used these secrets to develop the atomic bomb, which is major. And communism became the opposite of everything America represented. Now, around this time, many Americans were afraid that there were other communist spies among them, and they were not easy to identify. And so they lived in a state of fear and paranoia of, is their next door neighbor a communist spy, or someone in my family, or someone who works alongside me? So hence mass hysteria, just like in the Salem witch trials, mass hysteria. So speaking of mass hysteria, I think that this is a very intriguing picture, the effects of mass hysteria. And we could probably talk about this picture all class period, but I'm just going to show it to you to get your minds going. All right, so this is the flag of the Soviet Union, a couple of notes about it. So red is the color associated with communism. And the symbol in this flag is the hammer and sickle, because again, the premise of communism is work as hard as you can, divide money equally, and try to live as meagerly as possible. And so the hammer symbolizes industrialist work and the sickle symbolizes farm work. And so around this time, Joseph McCarthy was very influential in the United States of America. He was a senator, and he was also the head of the Committee of Un-American Activities. And when you think of un-American, what's un-American at the time? Well, communist sympathizers, communist spies, just communists in general. All right, so the HUAC was a committee that questioned Americans who were suspected of being communists. They summoned thousands of people to testify, and their goal was to get as many names of supposed communists as possible, just like in Salem witch trial, supposed witches. Joseph McCarthy, not only was he extremely influential during this time period, but he was also ruthless. He claimed that he had a list of 205 communists who worked in just the US government alone. And he was the ringleader of the Red Scare, which is the name of the mass hysteria of the Americans during this time of paranoia of either are they among communist spies or will they be accused of being a communist spy? They were constantly living on edge. So who was suspected of being a communist spy? Well, usually people who were eccentric or went against the grain, artists like filmmakers, directors, actors. Some politicians were also targeted. And when people were targeted, they had two options, just like the people in Salem had two options. They could either confess to witchcraft or they could be hanged. Well, people who were accused of being communists could either admit to being a communist, like confess that they were communists, even if they weren't, and tell McCarthy names of other people who supposedly attended the same communist meetings, or they could refuse to admit anything and provide any names, and therefore they would be blacklisted. So it's not the same as being hanged, but being blacklisted means being ostracized from society, being isolated in the community, and not being able to obtain work. And we need work in order to provide a livelihood. So it was like a death, but in a different way. All right, so some people who are accused of being communists, and this might take you by surprise. I know when I saw this for the first time, I'm like, Walt Disney, really? But think about it. During this time period, Walt Disney was definitely different. And he not only marched to a beat of his own drum, but his ideas were uncommon and they were artistic too. And so unfortunately, this attracted the attention of the HUAC. Ronald Reagan. All right, so even though Ronald Reagan was a president in the early 80s, what some may know or may not know is that he was an actor before he was a president. Martin Luther King Jr. was accused. And the author of The Crucible, Arthur Miller. All right, so if you think back to studying George Orwell's Animal Farm when you were in 8th grade, you may remember that on the surface, the story was about animals living on a farm and not getting fed and starving and becoming very unhappy, and then eventually banding together to overthrow Farmer Jones and take over the farm and make a society themselves where they take care of each other and provide a good life for all, no matter what the condition of the animal or what the age. And over time, that didn't happen because the pigs rose to power above the other animals and behaved in unethical ways and so on and so forth. So even though it looks like it's a story about animals on the surface, it was actually a story of the Russian revolutions, the emergence of the Soviet Union, and Joseph Stalin coming to power. And so that's called an allegory, because the allegory is a work of literature that tells one story on the surface, like Animal Farm, while referring to another subtextually, such as the Russian Revolution, Soviet Union, Stalin. Well, The Crucible is also an allegory. On the surface, it's a story about the Salem witch trials and mass hysteria and innocent people being accused. But the subtext is a story about McCarthyism. And I'll repeat that as I'm pretty sure it's on your guided notes. McCarthyism, the Red Scare, the Cold War, and just basically the topics that I've been covering over the last couple of minutes. All right. Oh, goodness. I thought part 3 was last part. Part 4, but I will be quick. I promise you. Here we go. Okay. So as you're aware, protagonist, the good guy, the antagonist is the bad guy. So think about like Mario's the good guy. Donkey Kong is the bad guy. The antagonist is Abigail Williams. She is Reverend Parris's daughter. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that she is living with Reverend Parris because she was orphaned. Her parents were murdered by Native Americans. And she's the leader of the group of girls who make the accusations. At one point, she was the maid in the Proctor's household. And during that time, she had an affair with John Proctor. And Abigail Williams, though she is evil, she is also smart and manipulative. And she happens to be very jealous because even though John Proctor ended that brief affair, it's still going on in Abigail Williams' head, if you know what I mean. All right, John Proctor, he's a farmer. He's in his 30s. He's married. And he's known around town as being proud and honest. Of course, the town does not know yet of John Proctor's poor choices with Abigail. His wife is Elizabeth Proctor. She is known to be moral and honest, and sometimes she comes across as cold, but think back to what life was like for women during that time period. They had to take care of the home. They had to take care of the children and the husband. They had everything they needed. They had to produce themselves. That was a very difficult way of life. So it's hard to say if being cold was her personality or just her survival mechanism from day to day. All right, and then the girls that are friends with Abigail again being the ringleader, and these are the girls who made the accusations, the teenage girls who didn't get to have fun. We have Betty Paris, which is Reverend Paris's daughter, and she's the girl who gets sick at the very beginning of the play that sort of gets the mass hysteria started. Ruth Putnam is the daughter of Thomas Putnam and his wife Goody Putnam, and they are wealthy, greedy landowners. Mary Warren is the servant of the Proctor. She replaced Abigail Williams, and so she's the current servant living in their home. And then Mercy Lewis is the servant of the Putnam family. You've heard me mention Reverend Paris a couple times. He is also mentioned in the National Geographic video. He's the town minister. He's paranoid about whether people like him or not, and mainly because the town does not like him. For one, his sermons are all about hell and damnation, which people are tired of hearing about it. And then also, he wasn't a modest personality. He was confident and I guess you can say ambitious. He wanted more than a pay and a home provided. He wanted things like the deed to his house. It wasn't enough that they provided him a house to live in, but he wanted to actually take ownership of it. He didn't want to have to pay for his own firewood. He wanted firewood in addition to his paycheck, and so on and so forth. So the people were like, we are barely getting by ourselves. Like, we don't like this guy. He's coming over asking too much and not even doing the kind of ministry that I was anticipating. So that's Reverend Paris for you. And then John Hale enters into the play towards the end of Act 1. He came over from the neighboring town of Beverly. He's known to be an expert on witchcraft, and he was called over because the children were sick. The doctors did not have an explanation, and so the townspeople were so worried about witchcraft that John Hale was asked to come over to determine if there were witches in Salem, and he had the reputation of being intelligent and logical. He's actually one of my favorite characters, and you'll see why by Act 3. All right, and I mentioned Tituba. She is Reverend Paris's slave. She is from Barbados. Part of her culture is voodoo, which, of course, the Puritans would look at suspiciously. And she was the first to be accused of witchcraft. She is an easy scapegoat to blame. Other characters include Giles Corey. He was the man who was pressed to death. Yes, in real life. He did exist in real life, and that's how he died in real life. His personality was outspoken. There were not official courts and official lawyers, but if there were, he would have probably been a lawyer. He filed lawsuits frequently. He was very knowledgeable and fought hard for his convictions. You also be introduced to Rebecca Nurse. She is a kind older woman, and it's quite surprising that eventually she's accused of witchcraft because she is so revered and trusted in the town that she's the midwife who delivers babies and attends to other medical needs. All right, last but not least, I'm going to pause this presentation and show you guys a 10-minute video of Arthur Miller explaining in his own words why he wrote The Crucible. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you guys enjoy this play. It's one of my favorites.